This is a case study presentation for Global Oil and Gas Industry for Management 692, Dr. Gopalakrishnan's class by Group 1, Marian George, Chunchin and Jeffery Day. In this presentation, we'll go over the introduction and the background of the oil industry, the structure of the industry, the type of oil company, OPEC, the competitive advantage, factors and impact, structured and dynamic and competitive dynamic, the reason for vertical integration, and the outlook of petroleum and gas industry. To say the oil and gas industry are among the most important resources or industry that we have is an understatement. Ever since Colonel Edwin Drake struck oil in Pennsylvania in 1859, the world has not been the same since. We have seen the creation of a monopoly company by Standard Oil Trust back in 1882. However, that was not Rockefeller's original intention, as his original intention was to create an economy of scale through the integration. However, because he created a monopoly that dominated the entire industry, the U.S. government intervened and created antitrust laws that we know today. The oil industry never really pushed to the point that we know of today until spindle top oil started using it as an automobile fuel for the automobile and aircrafts. And we have fast forward to the 1974 Arab oil embargoes, where the oil price quadrupled overnight from the 1950s level. So even though oil drives the economy, it is also impacted by the economy as well. As we see it in 1997 Asian financial crisis, there's a huge drop in the oil prices. Same thing in the 2007-2008 financial crisis, when oil was nearly about $180 per barrel, with prediction that it would exceed $200 per barrel. But because of the financial crisis, the price basically just crashed. Today, it kind of went back to about $40 a barrel, which is about where it has been for the past few years. But the analyst experts project the demand for oil is going to be higher. By 2040, it's going to be at least 40% higher as of today. In today's society, the petroleum industry have basically dominated our life through various products that we use it for. It ranges from our sunglasses, computer, disposable cups, the fuels for our cars, the fuel for aircraft, boats, and there's millions of chemicals that it's derived from the petroleum product. So it has a dramatic impact in our life today. What we're looking at in this particular slide is a 70-year-old historical chart for crude oil prices. The oil and gas industry is basically described as cyclical. It has its highs and lows. Oil companies try to mitigate the risk, try to stabilize the price as much as they can, if they could even control it. So if you look at this particular chart, you can see the 1970s Arab embargo drove the price up, and up in the 2006-2007 range, it peaked. Back then, experts were projecting a $200 barrel based on the trend, but that trend never happened when the market crashed and the price came down. Today, we're pretty much back to the level where it crashed when the market crashed, roughly about $40 to $50 a barrel, hovering in that range. When we talk about the structure of oil and gas industry, we usually talk about the value chain of the oil and gas industry itself. Generally, it is broken down into three categories: upstream, midstream, and downstream. As we mentioned in previous slide, that the industry is broken down into three sectors: upstream, midstream, and lowstream. Here is the illustration of it. Each one of the sector has their own specialties. In the upstream, it's where the field development, the exploration, and the production operation takes place. These are the people that actually find the oil, dig it out of the ground. Then you have the midstream, who are the transporters, the processors, and the storage and distributions. These are the people that operate the oil tankers, the storage tanks, the pipelines. Then you have the downstream, what they call manufacturing, which is actually the refining plant that refines the crude oil into a value product, such as vehicle fuels, petrochemicals, and they also take the final product and distribute them either through wholesale, retail, right into your vehicles or manufacturing as a raw materials. As we said on the previous slide, the oil industry can be broken down into upstream, midstream, and downstream. And each sector have their own specific specialties. In the upstream, you have the exploration, the field development, and the production operation. These are the people who actually dug the oil out of the ground. Then you have the midstream, and the midstreams are the company and the people that is responsible for transportation, storing, distribution, and in some degree processing um, on the gas end of it. Then you have the downstream, which is what I consider manufacturing or the refinery. This is where the value is actually really created, where you have crude oil comes into the refinery and becomes a fuel for vehicles or petrochemical products. And from there, it goes out to the retail distributions into the gas nozzle that pumps fuels into your cars. Now, in the oil industry, there are basically three types of company. The first type that we're going to talk about are the integrated oil company. These are very, very large companies that is truly vertically integrated. They take the crude oil, transport it, and refine it, and deliver it to the consumer. They are the If any industry had done this, oil industry is the one that truly does from cradle to grave, where they literally find the oil, extract it, ship it, refine, and distribute them. Today, we basically were looking at four major integrated company. They known as the Big Four: ExxonMobil, um, Royal Dutch Shell, Chevron, and BP. The second type of oil company that we want to talk about are the national oil company. These are state-owned companies, whether partially or full. China being one of the bigger country that owns two of the major NOCs, PetroChina and Sinopec are both Chinese oil companies, fully owned by the Chinese government. Then you have Petrobras, which is a kind of a new player in the industry, that is owned by Brazil government. Then you have Eni, which is the Italian company that does major distribution in Europe. The third type of oil companies are the independent companies. These are companies that tend to be smaller compared to the integrated or the national companies. By smaller, I don't mean they're kind of like a startup, but rather they just scale-wise are smaller compared to the integrated company. Companies like Schlumberg, Halliburton, Baker Hughes, these are what they call the exploration fee companies. They look for oil field, they assess the oil field, trying to figure out how much is in that reserve, and they also offer services on the extraction as well as the reserve management. So oil company could tap the oil reserve before the oil reserves get completely dry, they could find another source so they could continue the supply for the company that hires them. Um, then you have Reliant Industry and Formosa Petrochemicals, who are the refineries who supply the industry with petrochemical product, raw materials for textile industry. Um, when I say they are smaller, if you really think about it, Reliance has last year's earning is 51 billion. Formosa's petrochemical is 19 billion. So they are smaller relative to the integrated company, but they are not small by any means. In the oil industry, you really can't talk about it without talking about OPEC. OPEC is an intergovernmental organization that was created in 1960 by five founding nations: Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. Um, Majority of the time, Saudi Arabia is the leader of the OPEC, as they are the biggest producer in the OPEC. Um, what is interesting with OPEC is it is actually an international collusion where they try to control the price to their benefit. So, in a sense, if they could work together, they should be able to control the world's oil price. But they really don't, because they are, if we apply game theory and opportunistic behaviors, they are actually the victim of game theory with opportunistic behavior. The biggest culprit is Venezuela. They're kind of the biggest cheater as they're constantly producing above their quota. And this has to do with how Venezuela is structured because they were an oil producing company, so they expended very exorbitantly, incurring external debt. So by the mid 1980s, the economy basically have crippled because they have so much debt that they can't pay up. So they keep on pumping oil and making the cycle worse. So in terms of cheaters like Venezuela in a collusion um, group, OPEC's influential power is actually somewhat limited because people like that. Then you have the new player, Angola, Nigeria, Algeria, Libya. They are producers, but at the same time, they're also not a wealthy they were not a wealthy nation. So everybody is trying to get the most out of their fields. So there's a lot of cheating in terms of OPECs on the quotas. So their ability to control the oil price it's somewhat limited today. And what we're looking at here is the Porter's generic strategy for competitive advantages. Competitive advantages is how the firm position, whether it's above or below the industry average. In order to stay above the industry average, you really had to look at it from two perspectives: your cost and differentiations. Most of the integrated oil company they focus on cost because they want to streamline everything, control everything as they can, um, achieving efficiency, so they could deliver the product cheaper than anybody else could. Then you have the independents who really need to compete with the integrated companies. So they need to find a competitive advantage of them, but they can't compete in terms of market cap because international integrated oil companies are very large. So what they do is they compete in terms of differentiation. So like Schlumberg and Halliburton and Baker Hughes, they specialize in finding the oil field, assess the oil field, and manage the oil field. Where the low stream player like Reliance and Formosa Petroleum specializes on refinery. The factor that impacts structure and competitive dynamics of oil industry, it's actually very wide and broad. As oil and gas production, they have operation across the world, so they're very heavily impacted by political, economic, and social and technological variables in the operation environment. While the general consumption assumption is the oil and gas industry are ludicrous rich industry, that is not the case. They are not really that loaded with cash as people would assume. Um, One of the reasons for that is the industry suffers through peaks and valleys, where some years they're very profitable, making ludicrous profit. Other years they'll be losing their shares for many years. So when it averages out, when the U.S. manufacturing in average earning about 6%, oil and gas industry only slightly above the average at 8%. The performance on the return it's not that much better either. For integrated oil company, they average about 7.66%, and they rank about 80 at around 83 out of the 500 for the S&P 500 companies. Um, in terms of political turmoil and volatility impacts the industry tremendously. Let's take a country like Iran, Iraq, for example. The country is constantly at war, instabilities. So a oil-rich country like Iran actually need to import refined goods because they are not able to get the oil out or get the or have an efficient way to refine the oil. So with the increasing demand, they actually need to import. Same goes for Mexico. They have the same issue. Mexico's issue it's not like it's not the not as bad as the Iran in terms of politics, but they are nationalized and they are now run very efficiently. So they also rely on imported goods, imported refined goods to sustain their demand. Now, in terms of the resources, the national operating companies actually control 90% of the resources. So a lot of smaller companies like Schlumberg, Halliburton, and Baker Hughes, they had to need to play nice with those national companies. So they provide them a service by helping them explore the field, manage the reserve to earn a keep. Then you have OPEC, which we talk about how they have a collusion problem and where members don't actually cooperate, each have their own interest in mind. Um, then you have on the downstream, there's gas station with convenience stores. Now, in terms of downstream, the gas station they're actually not that profitable, but convenience stores are. So a lot of gas stations have convenience store there because they offset the um, or make up for the profits for operating a gas stations. However, the oil industry itself generally don't like convenience stores because they see convenience stores crossing field to a different market. But at the same time, they have a new entrance threat from supermarkets that's selling gasoline. For the supermarket, they have an advantage of location, they have an advantage of brand recognitions, and they don't see gasoline as a crossing field. It's more or less like another product that they sell. And that makes them very competitive to the oil company because the mentality is different, so they operate it a little differently. Then you have the renewable energies, like windmills, lithium battery cars, that it's using less gasoline, um, driving the demands now. Right now, they're not much of a threat, but as the companies like GM, Tesla ramp up their productions, they might have some impact on the foreseeable future. So there are threats that the oil company need to look at and see what they could do to balance the threats out, um, and leverage what they have. Like a integrated company, they have the bargaining power of the supplier, they have the bargaining power of the buyer, relatively speaking, in terms of if you're looking at a refinery, because they also control the supply, they could control the output on the refinery as well. On the last slide, we briefly talk about controlling the balance on the for the integrated company. And the reason for vertical integration is really about control and streamline the efficiencies. It is exactly what Rockefeller was trying to do. Um, Rockefeller was trying to consolidate everything so he could profit from the economy of scale. Now, in terms of economy of scale, the oil company basically ramp up the production as quickly and much as they can. On the transportation, they have bigger and wider oil tanker that carry more on one trip. Um, because there's so few companies that operate in true integration, oil industry actually operates as an oligopoly model. Um, they also have the ability to hedge against market downturns. So, for example, like refinery, right now the crude oil prices is low. When the crude oil prices is low, it's actually very beneficial for the refinery because the refinery are not being hit from both ends, because the refinery are buying a crude oil as a commodity, selling gasoline as another commodity. So to operate as a downstream player, refinery are usually kind of like the sandwich being crushed in from two sides. Now, on the integrated operating oil company, they could balance that things out. So they may not be making a lot or just breaking even on the crude oil, but they could make a fortune on refinery. So by ramping up the refinery um, supplies and productions, they could actually compensate for the loss on the crude oil. Now, when the crude oil is high, crude oil for the price is high, they could cut down the refinery and really truly control the market and not subject the market to the environment volatilities, which it already has enough impact on it already. On the short-term outlook of the petroleum and gas industry, um, because the industry is so volatile, um, oil companies tend to look at things at the long term, especially those large integrated oil company. So in some sense, they kind of be mocked as the dinosaur. And for them, from their perspective, they operated at a proven model where what used to work will continue to work. But in the modern day, that may not be true, because as the resources become more scarce, the conventional well are drying up. So people in the industry are looking for an unconventional, deep water, renewable assets that require different operating models. And the integrated oil company, and the oil company, they really need to look at this and learn from the independent company that is very agile, very adaptive to the change of technology. Like technology like the unconventional fields such as oil sand, shale gas, oil fracking, these are areas that oil company need to look at and consider. Is it feasible to do? Right now, they're operating at a loss level because on the average, fracking and shale gas, they cost anywhere between $55 to $60 per barrel. When the market price is below that, they're not operating at a break even. They're actually breaking at a operating at a loss. This is not the case for company like not company a nation like Saudi Arabia, where their operating cost is around $20 a barrel. So in some sense, the Saudis can outcompete anyone because their operation cost is so low. Um, so for oil companies and actually nations, they really need to look at where the market is right now and where they need to go and what can they do with the unconventional resources and become a little more agile like the independent companies that can make quick changes as they need to adapt to the environment. And nations like Mexico, it also opens up opportunity for many companies as the company can now invest in Mexico. Oil company are probably going to be rushing in, negotiating access to the well while they build up the infrastructure in Mexico to refine the crude oil and import the refined goods into the country. So it's a multiple pronged approach, and that's what an oil company needs to do for the next few years. Now, in terms of looking at the long-term outlook for the oil and gas industry, we're looking at 10 years and beyond. Um, One of the things that they've been talking about in the industry is artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is going to change the industry into a data-driven industry. So when the industry transform into a data-driven industry, they'll need data scientists, statisticians, machine learning specialists. They'll need more PhD data scientists than the geologists that they have today. Um, and there's the other thing is the automations. As the automation automate all the repetitive operations, it frees up the engineer to do other things. Another factor that comes in is the millennials. Millennials are starting to entering the management level, so they bring a different type of thinking, different type of operating um, sense into the industry. So oil company needs to create an environment to accommodate those new talent, the young millennial talents. So they need to think about their organizational structure and change it. So they need to become more agile, flexible, become more like um, a talent base, so group can be formed quickly rather than going through the traditional hierarchies, bureaucratic hierarchies that they currently have. Um, Oil companies should also look into diversification, such as in lithium mining, where rather than thinking themselves as a oil and gas industry, they really need to think of themselves as the energy industry. Then you have the global warming that's causing the ice cap to melt, where polar ship lane is melting, where ship lane is not available before through the North Pole. It may become available. So ship lane method is going to change, and when that change, that region it's up for grab. So oil company also need to look at what can they do in the polar region and the region exploration. So for conclusions, the global demand for oil and gas has not slowed down despite the recent year oil price drop. Regardless of the development and government push for renewable energy, we have yet to see a real upscale production of use of those energy sources. The renewable energy sector remain kind of like a supplemental energy source. Alternative fuel, electrical car is somewhat limited in a small scale to personal and consumer product, where majority transportations like aircraft, um, ships, and even railroads are still very fossil fuel dependent. Um, Granted that we have seen new technology emerging in the oil industry, we have yet to see a game-changing technology that truly challenged the industry as a replacement product. So oil and gas would remain vital for the world's economy, and they will have a direct impact on the industry and global economy as well, and continue to do that. Um, the integrated oil company and independents will need to form strategic partnerships and research to reach those reach the resource-rich nations and gain more access to the oil and gas field in order to meet the global demand. Um, Technology and unconventional advance, they have shown that you know they can have an impact, but as technology advances more, the unconventional fields um, will have a little more influence in terms of how much OPEC could actually change or influence the industry. Um, they're already not very efficient as it is. So in the near future, we don't see OPEC as a influential player. They are important, but they're not going to be able to influence or tip the scale to their favor as much as they like. Um, Another thing is about the oil industry is company know the resource is finite. There's there's limited fossil fuels and petroleums and gas that they could extract out of the ground. The big question is how much can they extract? When will the peak occur? Right now, that is anybody's guess. And as time goes on, they might discover new technologies, new way to extract fuels that they have not thought of before. Um, and they might be able to continue to meet the demand of the world. Um, as far as the industry in general, they have survived 100 years. They probably will continue to survive for the next maybe 40, 50 years until we could find a substitute fuel source to replace the petroleum fuel. Um, and until then, the global demand will continue to rise, and it will continue to be a very vital part of the global economy. This concludes our presentation for Group 1.